Welcome back. Now we answer questions we receive from you, our viewers. If you have a question, visit our website, QuranSpeaks.com. Dr. Shabir, the question is, I recently saw one of your videos on evolution in which you indicated that one of the ways to bridge the gap between Islam and evolution is to accept that evolution may have been a miracle of God in itself, and it doesn't have to contradict Islam. I find your answer rather satisfying, but the more I think about it, the more I stumble on the question of Adam being the first man. If we look at man through the lens of evolution, Homo sapiens gradually came into being through the process of evolution, wherein multiple hominids preceded the modern Homo sapien. There is no distinctive line where the perfect Homo sapien suddenly appeared, but rather the process was gradual. If we are to assume that evolution may be a miracle of God, how do we address the issue of Adam being the first man?
That's a very important question, and there is no easy answer.
Okay.
So what we can say, for starters, is that the theory of evolution is obviously a very modern theory. People did not have this idea. There are inklings from the writings of Muslim scholars in the past, pre-Darwinian, that seem to have the openness towards the idea that creatures might have evolved and so on. But people did not think of Adam evolving. Or human beings. They always thought of human beings as a special creation.
Mm-hmm.
And even after, 160 years after Darwin, we still find that people who are outside of Islam, they have great difficulty accepting the theory. Scientists naturally do. Scientists widely accept that evolution is the way that things are happening, and that many believers will say, well, this is God's way of making things happen. But some traditional followers of previous scriptures, they will insist, no, this is not acceptable. So even after 160 years of Darwinian theorizing about evolution, and even stacking proof upon proof that it happens this way, many people are still resistant to the idea. And the idea would have been a simple one that, as we human beings are, they notice everything being created, there must have been a first man. There must have been, we can go logically, like, who created your parents? And, you came from your parents and they came from their parents, but there must have been a first parent that is not himself a child. And so on. So people would have had this simple idea, and to explain to them the whole theory of evolution some 1,400 years ago in the Quran, this would have been a mighty distraction. It would have started a new controversy, whereas the most important thing to convey to them was that there was only one God at that time. So the Quran naturally did not go into great details about this. But there is a Muslim idea that the Quran is reflecting knowledge from the unseen sources given to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the Quran says, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. You have not been given of knowledge except a little. So God's knowledge is vast, and God had to be selective in what He is revealing to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, at that time, to achieve the objective which was necessary at that time, to bring people away from their polytheistic concepts to the idea that there is only one God. And that was a challenge in itself. To get people to believe that there is a life hereafter was also a challenge. So the Quran concentrated on these issues and did not bother to explain this whole theory of evolution. But we can see in the Quran that there are certain statements, the way they are put, they lend themselves to accommodate the theory of evolution, which comes to be described later on. So, for example, what do you make of the fact that in the Quran we have it that there is this garden, Adam and his spouse are in the garden, and Satan is, before even that, Satan is driven out from the inception. God says to them, bow down to Adam. Satan refuses. God says to Satan, get out from here. It's not suitable for you. So Satan is driven out from the garden. Now, after Adam and his spouse eat from the tree, they too are naturally driven out. And it's mentioned in the dual, because Arabic has a way of, mentioning a singular, or mentioning two persons, or mentioning a plural, which is three or more persons. So in the 20th chapter of the Quran, they are told, in the dual, to get out. But in the second chapter of the Quran, in the 38th verse, interestingly enough, they're addressed in the plural, as if there are more than two persons. But if Adam and Eve were the only two persons, why this plural? Um, so some will say, well, Satan as well, but Satan was already driven out. And once he had been driven out, how could he go back into the garden? It's possible. It's possible that he disobeyed and he was, slivered himself in. It's also possible that there were other people apart from Adam and Eve at the time, in which case Adam would have been chosen to represent the whole group, or maybe as a prophet to the whole group. Not even maybe, because it's a Muslim belief that Adam was a prophet, and the Quran in the 20th chapter does actually say, ثُمَّ اجْتَبَاهُ رَبُّهُ فَتَابَ عَلَيْهِ وَهَدَاهُ. God, and then his Lord chose him and forgave him and guided him. So when God uses this expression, chose him and guided him, according to the tafsir of Ar-Razi, that means he is given a prophetic mission. So there are indications in the Quran that Adam may not have been alone. He and his spouse. There could have been other people at the time.
So are there indications then that he might not have been the first man, or is that more explicit in the Quran?
Well, what I've explained previously is that you have these hominins, as the questioner is asking. So we know now from scientific studies that there were hominins prior to Homo sapiens. So scientists can trace a long line from Australopithecus, to they will say there was Homo habilis, the tool making man, and then Homo erectus, the upright man. And then we have Homo sapiens, and the distinction between these groups is not so very distinct, because we're talking about millions of years of evolution. Homo erectus may have been with us from about 750,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens from about maybe 200 to 300,000 years ago. And when we're talking about thousands of years, there's naturally overlapping. So the populations do not, suddenly change into something else. Just that, like, we are very similar to our parents, and our children are so similar to us that one might look at the nose and say, okay, this child has got the mother's nose, or something like this. But it's over a long period of time with the accumulation of many gradual and small incremental changes that we see that, if we look at the before and after picture, it's almost like a person losing weight, right? Day to day, you don't see the difference. But if you look at the before and after picture, which we are shown many of when weight loss products are being advertised to us, then you see a vast difference between the before and the after. So in a similar way, in the lineup, you can see a vast difference between the before and the after at the two ends of the spectrum. But in between, the change is very gradual. So at what point did Homo erectus change into Homo sapiens? So this was sometime, within the last, couple of 100,000 years. And then too, it was gradual and more complex than a simple, transition from one to another. And we can say that at a certain point, just as languages change, to use an analogy given by Dennis Venema in his book Adam and the Genome, languages change gradually over time. Like we speak the same language as our parents, and our children speak the same language as us. But the youth are always coming up with new terms. I sometimes have to ask the young people, like, what is that term? What does it mean? And they know what it means, and I know that they're speaking my language. But I know that they're introducing new terms. But eventually, their newly introduced terms become dominant. They become so widespread that it's part of the language. And in fact, people may forget the old ways of expressing things. So as languages change gradually over time, though we're always recognizing it to be the same language, until we see the before and after, we realize that the English language has changed so drastically from the time like the first Bibles were printed to the time to our modern English now. If we look at some old Bibles, we'll have some difficulty reading them, even though they're written in what was intended to be the English language at the time. So languages change, the human composition changes as well. So at a certain point, this change, and not so much as a point, but gradually, this change occurred, and we are seeing the end result of this change now. So to say that Adam was the first man, it seems to me, is not necessary from the Quran itself.
So how would you understand then the verses where God is describing how he created Adam and breathed life into him, the whole account, the whole narrative of, asking the angels to bow down towards Adam. It seems from that it was a very special creation, right?
Yes, and I want to add here before answering this particular question, Safiyyah, that it follows from what I've just said that somebody's going to think, but wait a minute, where do Muslims get the idea that Adam was the first man?
Mm-hmm.
Well, partly from the Quran, partly from knowing the Genesis account already, and knowing what Christians and Jews around Muslims already believed. And also Muslims today can point to a hadith related from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, apparently, in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, says something like, "Kullukum li Adam wa Adam min turab." You are all of Adam, and Adam is from clay, so or from dust. So one would get the idea from all of these different sources that yes, Adam was the first person. On a simplistic reading of the passage you just mentioned, yes, that would be almost like the Quran confirming what people already knew from the Bible. But when one looks closely at the text of the Quran, which one is forced to do because the science has itself evolved and given us new information, new vistas into the past, now we have to go back to the Quran and ask, is this accommodatable within the Quran? Because this is new knowledge. We cannot just simply shun this new knowledge. And all Muslim scholars, no matter how traditional they are, eventually they are forced to look at empirical knowledge and then go back to the Quran and interpret the Quran in the light of empirical knowledge. Many years ago, I associated with some youth who were so fascinated with the scholars in the Middle East that, no matter what question came up, they would be on the phone to the scholars in the Middle East to find out, what's the verdict about this. Because those scholars, they trusted to be very traditional. They're not like our modernizing scholars who are living in the West and, being influenced by modern ideas. And so they would ask those scholars. Now, in a collected fatwa, a collected book of verdicts from one of those scholars, Sheikh Muhammad ibn Salih al-Uthaymeen, he deals with the verse of the Quran from Surah Luqman, the 31st chapter of the Quran, probably the last verse, which says that there are certain things which only God knows. Now, one of those things is what's in the womb of the mother. So he's now addressing the question, what about the fact that people have knowledge of what's in the womb through ultrasound? So he says, well, we must always interpret the Quran in the light of empirical knowledge, basically. We know now that this is a fact that people know what's in the womb. So we must interpret the Quran in the light of that. You cannot deny that knowledge and then keep to a traditional interpretation of the Quran. What was the traditional interpretation of the Quran? Simply put, nobody knows because you can't see in there. But now we know. So now his interpretation changes. The interpretation might still hold on to some aspects of the tradition by saying, okay, well, only God knows the future of this child. Even though you can see the ultrasound image, only God knows the future of this child. And moreover, the ultrasound is not going to show you every aspect. Still, there are certain hidden aspects which are, again, known only to God. So there is an attempt to bridge what the Quran says with the modern knowledge, and that means to a certain extent ignoring the commentaries that have gone by previously because people interpreted according to what they knew at the time. So now we look back at the Quran and we interpret not only in the light of the fact that we have the ultrasound images of human embryos, but also we interpret the Quran in the light of the fact that we have fossil evidence, we have genetic evidence that point to the evolution of the hominins over time, producing as an end result the Homo sapien species, of which we are a part. So what we can say then in short is that the verses that you mentioned should not be interpreted in, outside of this knowledge. And when we put the two together, we can say that, okay, God is telescoping the narrative, giving us in brief what we needed to know at that time. And which still is relevant to us today. Like we can say in a nutshell, here is how you started out. You started out from nothing, and here you are as a human being, proud as you are. Just remember that God created you, and you have to, in the end, end up in your grave. You have to face God and account for your deeds. So that's in a nutshell what the Quran is trying to convey. And to go into all of the details, okay, you shared a common ancestry with chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. People would have been going, we're not going to believe in this book, right? So the whole idea about judgment and responsibility for deeds and so on would have been lost because people would just be laughing themselves silly over what the Quran said at the time. But I would say in a nutshell that the Quran is not so clear as people have thought. That Adam was the first human being. He could have been from a pool of human beings. He might have been selected as a prophet to them. So we find in the 20th chapter of the Quran, in the 124th verse, I believe it is, where the Quran says, ثُمَّ اجْتَبَاهُ رَبُّهُ فَتَابَ عَلَيْهِ وَهَدَاهُ. Then God chose him and forgave him and guided him. And this is interpreted to mean that God made him a prophet, which would mean that he was a prophet to the people at the time.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr.
You're
Shabir.
welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.